This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs. The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Now, here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. Benjamin Franklin is often credited with the observation that nothing in life is certain but death and taxes. While no one has as yet come up with a cure for human mortality, individuals and entities around the world have actually been quite effective at finding ways to avoid rendering unto Caesar. Today, we'll take a look at various efforts at tax reform around the world and the cost countries pay when revenue goes uncollected. Our guide on this taxing tour is Jeffrey Sommers, professor of political economy at UW-Milwaukee and senior fellow at the Institute of World Affairs. In addition to his teaching and research, he's provided counsel to individual investors and governments and has contributed to media outlets such as the Financial Times, the World Financial Review, and the New York Times. Jeff, welcome back.
Doug, great to be here. Happy New Year.
Same to you. Well, let's start off uncharacteristically with sort of a domestic angle on this story. Our incoming freshman member of Congress, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, made some waves in the media with an interview in which he suggested that perhaps a 70% corporate tax rate might be just the thing for the economy. And I think for many viewers, that seemed like an outlandishly large number. Is it?
No. And in fact, it's quite a modest proposal. Not in the Swiftian sense of the term, but in a rather measured, sober sense of the term. I think that Congresswoman Cortez has mentioned something that has needed to be mentioned for a long time. And that is that, in effect, we've run this 4-decade-long experiment, a supply-side economic experiment, in which we thought that we could increase investment, research and design spending, and then thus spurring growth and making everyone more prosperous if we just cut taxes. Well, the results have been in for quite some time. And of course, I think they have not been good. And I think that is what Congresswoman Cortez is pointing out. For the longest time, we actually had top marginal income tax rates in the 90% range, and also in the 70% range. And in fact, it was this way for most of the 20th century, including what is often referred to as the golden age of U.S. capitalism, and for West European capitalism as well. That is the period after World War II, what's often referenced as the Bretton Woods Order. So she is giving quite sound counsel, and she seems to be learning about the issue and imparting valuable lessons for all.
Well, so as we mentioned in the introduction, I mean, there are many governments around the world sort of addressing the issue of taxes and tax avoidance. And first of all, let's draw that distinction. What's the difference between tax avoidance and tax evasion?
Yeah, I mean, avoidance is essentially using legal means to avoid paying taxes. Evasion is you're breaking the law. Now, of course, as we've learned, I think in the state of Wisconsin, at the risk of being somewhat controversial, oftentimes what has happened when people in positions of power have wished to avoid something, what started off as avoidance later became maybe at best evasion. So you change the law, in short. And we've had some significant problems with this over the past, again, about 4 decades in terms of making it very, very easy to escape taxation. But before we proceed further, I think it's vitally important to actually reference what Congresswoman Cortez mentioned in her most recent 60 Minutes interview, and that is that when we're talking about marginal income tax rates, we're not saying that all of your income gets taxed at 70%. It's just that we define some threshold at which after you earn a certain point, it begins to get taxed at this higher rate. Now, during this golden age of capitalism, which I referenced before, the Bretton Woods period, the 1950s and the 1960s chiefly, That rate was, in today's dollars, about $3.7, $3.8 million. So in other words, anything you made up to that first $3.8 million was taxed at a lower rate, lower rates. You progressively went up this ladder, and then once you reached the top of that bracket ladder, you would start seeing your income, anything that you made after $3.8 million, taxed at 90%. So it's not people like you and me, Doug, that have much to worry about in this, but there are some people who do have rather high incomes, and some of that money needs to be redistributed back through the economy so that it can spur consumption, and this in turn spurs investment, actually, which then generates more growth. And then if you're making over $3.8 million, you're probably going to make even more money than you would have otherwise. So this is how a demand-side economy works.
So if you're operating financially at that level, you have access to a number of strategies, and one of the most effective these days is the notion of tax havens. So
right.
You can park your profits somewhere where they're not subject to that kind of thing. So talk a little bit in a corporate context about how that works.
Yeah.
If I'm Apple, if I'm Google, how do I use the varying tax rates around the world to my advantage?
Sure. So this is, in effect, tax shopping. So you go and you try and find the lowest rate that you can find. Now, you mentioned Apple, which I think currently is listed as the third most valuable company in the world. And they have located many of their activities in Europe for just this reason. As we've seen locally here in Milwaukee as well, with Johnson Controls going to Ireland. So you have a number of ways in which you can locate your operations abroad in order to get taxed at a more favorable rate. Now, that said, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the history, though, of this issue of tax avoidance and evasion, so that people might get a sense of how it began and how we got here. I think the history is really, really important. It has a long history, as you may gather. People don't like to pay taxes. But we've also had more intelligent tax codes in the past, which have been very good at channeling money into investment in ways that we really don't right now. Again, under the supply side set of policies that we presently have, we are not making it prohibitively expensive or painful to avoid paying or to evade taxation. And so what I mean by that is that, again, during this Bretton Woods period, while we had these top marginal income tax rates at very, very high levels, and we had capital gains tax levels that were placed rather high as well, you could actually get write-offs for productive investment. So if, let's say you owned a business, let's say you were making hammers, well, if you didn't want to pay that top marginal income tax rate, let's just say your hammer business was doing quite well, smashingly well, to use a pun, you could say, hey, instead of paying this top rate in terms of capital gains or income, I'm going to buy some new machinery. And instead of my current machine, which spits out 1,000 hammers an hour, I'm going to be spitting out 1,100 hammers per hour. That increases productivity in the economy generally. It's a substantial increase in wealth that can be measured and that can be had through this kind of investment. Well, that's what was happening through much of the manufacturing sector at that time. So actually very few people were paying these top levels of taxes, these top rates. They were actually able to avoid doing so through engaging in productive investment.
So tax avoidance in that era actually had a stimulative effect.
It did, and that's what we need to return to. Tax policy is an art, and regulation is an art. It has to be constantly refined and redefined, because you have, on the opposing side, people who are always trying to avoid it, and that's understandable. But we need to get back to this idea that you can actually make the economy more productive by providing these incentives to invest. Now, when I mentioned the history of tax avoidance, not just evasion, it was really following World War I, where we had the first 70% top marginal income tax rate introduced in France, following that tragic conflict in which you had hundreds of thousands of young men tragically maimed. And as they introduced this high level of taxation, comparatively at the time high level, because that became the norm throughout nearly the entire 20th century, Swiss banks provided an exit for French capital. They said, hey, bring your money down here. If you don't want to pay for those poor guys that lost their limbs or were maimed and mutilated, send your money to us. And there were several people who did just that. So there are these channels, and they have to be cut off. And the offshore banking sector was controlled during that Bretton Woods period that I referenced. At the risk of going on a long digression or lecture, and we have very limited time, I think the history is very important to understand that following World War II, the leaders of the United States in Britain finally came around to the idea that tax avoidance and evasion, especially evasion, was highly destructive to the international order and did not contribute to a stable order. Instead, it increased inequality, as it did in the 1920s, and it generated chaos, and it made money expensive, because when money is not around at home to be available to borrow, interest rates go up, therefore it gets expensive, therefore there's less economic activity because the costs of borrowing are higher. So these significant faults in the structure of the international economy were finally settled following the destruction of the not so much the United States, but of Europe following World War II. And they really controlled capital movements, controlled offshore banking, and for a while there was very, very little of it. There was very, very little of it. But they created the seeds of the system's unraveling through a necessary device, which was called the euro-dollar market in London. And that is that multinational companies, because of all of the countries in Europe, so many of them, you had to find a way of avoiding being taxed every time you moved your money from one country to the next if you were a multinational company. So they tolerated, quite smartly, this euro-dollar market, but it became the means by which later a rather robust, destructive, and even stronger offshore banking system could be reconstructed. And in the 1970s, that process began.
So talk a little bit about this notion of tax havens. I mean, there are places like Bermuda, for example, where the effective rate is zero. If I can somehow structure my business in such a way where it seems that my profits were actually made in Bermuda, then my effective tax rate is zero.
Right. Well, the old saying about having an accountant if you're in business, that if you showed any profit in your business, it's time to get a new accountant. You want to suggest that you're not making any money for purposes of taxes, right? So we have this rather unfortunate and again, very destructive infrastructure of tax avoidance and evasion globally. And it's really quite global. I mean, it's everywhere from the Cayman Islands to Panama, to Ireland, to the UK, to Malta, to Cyprus, to the place where I do a good bit of research, Latvia, which serves as one of the chief centers for the exit of capital from the post-Soviet bloc as it makes its escape to banks in London. So you essentially set up a shell company, a limited liability corporation. One of our states here, the United States, actually serves as one of the chief providers for this service, the state of Delaware. Former Vice President Joe Biden, that was the state, of course, that he represented for so many years as a senator. You then, from the point of having this shell company, which can actually prevent the tracing of its true owners. I mean, you can have these numbered accounts in which you don't even really have to have a name on them. Hide your money in these, you can domicile it in these offshore banks. And so, this has been done to an increasing extent the past 4 decades. And now we find ourselves in a situation in which it's estimated that upwards of $28 trillion are deposited in these kinds of banks. Banks which do not serve the traditional service that you or I would think about, which is providing people that don't have enough money, say, to buy a house. So they lend to you at 4%, and you pay that money back over a certain period of years, and then as those payments are coming in, they're relending that money out to others who can purchase their homes. This is a very different kind of banking. This is a kind of banking whose purpose is to conceal money. And oftentimes, it's used by politicians in countries as well to engage in corruption. So let's say you, and this is not necessarily hypothetical, it's actually an actual example, but I'm not going to mention the names. Let's say you purchase a fleet of city buses from a bus manufacturer in Poland, and you want a 4 or 5 or 6% cut off the top of that sale price as the city official who actually purchases those buses. Well, you can do that, but how do you do it? Well, you're going to need a bank which can take a deposit from a shell company, and that you then can later access through having usually a physical sheet of paper which has an account number on it that allows you to have it. So this is one of the reasons why so few politicians actually go after offshore banks around the world. They are among its customers. And the release of the Panama Papers a couple of years ago revealed the extent to which this is a problem, even in countries which we often think of or assume are squeaky clean, such as Iceland. I mean, it had some of its top government officials which were exposed as having these kinds of accounts. So it's very, very common. And we know that our former Republican presidential candidate, Mitt Romney, also avails himself of these kinds of services. I'm sure it's not illegal, it's evasion, not avoidance, but nonetheless, it happens in this very widespread fashion.
So what about from the perspective of the country that is lowering its effective tax rate? I'm looking at the example of Ireland, for example.
Right.
It had a very positive effect on the Irish economy. Suddenly, particularly in the tech industry, companies were flocking to Ireland for precisely that reason. So
Right.
What is the argument against that if you're the Irish government?
Yeah, I mean, Ireland had a very unique advantage because of its proximity to the United Kingdom, because Celtic is no longer the indigenous language, the native language that is spoken. It is English. And so it made it quite easy, actually, to engage in this kind of activity, to attract this kind of business. And also, of course, you had many people of Irish American descent who were also quite comfortable in using it for this purpose. The way that you can actually control this, if you want to, is to prevent capital transfers from those countries. You can close off, if you want, the servicing of dollar accounts from those countries. I mean, if you really wanted to play hardball, I mean, that's how you could do it. So at present, the regulations and the rules are not in place to really effectively control this. And that's what we need to discuss, is when we pursue the very sound policy that Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has tendered, well then, what do we do about the issue of capital flight? Now, income is a little trickier in terms of this offshore issue. It's not as much of a problem as it is with wealth, but nonetheless, it is still a problem because a lot of compensation that's currently paid out as income will be paid out as wealth, as capital, stocks, et cetera, if we move to these higher levels of income tax rates. So we have to think this all through and assemble really a high-level team of people who can put together the policies required to make this work. It can work. It has worked in the past. It'll take a lot of political will, but it's essential that we do it because we have seen now 4 decades of relatively low economic growth. We see it continuing to decline. Levels of research and development spending are declining. And the only way that we're able to effectively sustain our economy at present and it's not just in the United States, but throughout much of the world, is by making recourse to credit. I mean, that's how we make up the demand deficit. If people aren't being paid enough to consume the goods and the services that the economy can make, well, then how do you get them the money to actually buy stuff? Well, you do it through extending credit. But what's the problem there? Well, interest compounds, and then bankers ultimately have to be paid, and then you get a financial collapse. So that's the model that we have now of this extension of credit, financial collapse, extension of credit, financial collapse. It doesn't work.
Well, looking at a global level, I mean, obviously governments that are unable to collect taxes to which they think they are due have less revenue. Now, in the United States, the dollar amounts, of course, because of the size of the economy, are very large, but it's not as significant here as a percentage of GDP as it is in other places. Talk a little bit about what that means if you're Argentina, for example, and what this tax avoidance means to the Argentine economy.
Right. Well, I mean, it's even more important to countries which are even smaller than Argentina, which Argentina is kind of an interesting case because actually it has a really big internal market. I don't want to get into the specifics too much of it. But if you take a look at countries like the Baltic States, which of course I'm quite familiar with, which are highly import dependent, and if they can't collect tax revenue, then what happens is that and because they use a currency like the euro, which is not their own, which they can't redenominate down in order to make it less expensive to use their own products, it severely limits their ability to fund things like social welfare states. I mean, especially given the fact that, again, so much of their consumption is based on imports. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, it has a much bigger effect in smaller countries because smaller countries, in the main, are more import dependent. They don't have the same a broad composition of their economies that larger countries do. And so it introduces some other complexities.
So, we talked a little bit about the history. I mean, at what point did tax policy become weaponized? I mean, this idea of, well, I'm in a bit of a financial strait. What I will do is lower my tax rate, and I will be able to siphon all of this capital and investment from elsewhere into my country rather than yours.
Yeah, I mean, so we have this beggar thy neighbor set of tax policies, right, that you're referring to, which does nothing to actually grow the total economy of the world. It just is a game of musical chairs in which you're trying to ensure that you're not left without a chair. And so
is it a bit like sort of the global analog to states that are trying to attract away each other's companies by
definitely. That's what I mean. And this is what I'm saying by this kind of beggar thy neighbor set of policies which we see in place. I mean, because what you're trying to do is, instead of generating the conditions for creating more productive investment and economic growth in the total economy, you just want to see if you can steal something from your neighbor, get some enterprise to come to you. Now think about that. What does that do to increase overall economic growth? Nothing. In fact, it may even slow it because you have new transaction costs, new costs that are levied for starting up a new business, moving, etc. But you're making that up by having a lower set of taxes, and also maybe you're also doing some wage shopping as well, and maybe paying workers less. This does nothing to make an economy more productive. It's just, again, a beggar thy neighbor kind of policy, which ultimately is counterproductive for any country in the long run, because it makes for a lower growth environment.
So in an era where we've seen the rise of nationalism, is there a nationalist component to all of this? I mean, what you're proposing is a sort of leveling that financial playing field, but what would be the likely response on the part of someone who said, no, it's we're going to make country X great again, and this is one way of doing it?
Yeah, you can certainly do that, but if you have, and this would require a big political change, but maybe that political change is on the horizon. I mean, with figures like Congresswoman Cortez, with people like Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, let's say they come into power, if we see this progressive turn with the Labor Party there, we might have a new set of policies which see the United States and the United Kingdom, and these are the two principal players that you need to have cooperating because they are the biggest actual centers for handling money in the world, to cooperate to stop this kind of activity. And if you have this kind of what's referenced in labor relations terms, wage dumping, looking for the lowest wages, or tax dumping, looking for the lowest tax rates, and if you're just engaging in beggar thy neighbor policies, I mean, you can hit countries quite hard if you want to by, again, not handling transactions in the currencies that they're using. Now, let's say they want to go to some just local currency, and let's say they're a small country. Well, they can do that, but it's probably not going to lead to a prosperous economy emerging. So there are several things that you can do, but the most important point that I want to reference that's related to what you just said is that I think much of the kind of nationalist, kind of authoritarian, chauvinistic kind of political movements that we're seeing in places like Hungary with Viktor Orban, or whether we're seeing it in Poland or Italy, and several other countries right now in both Europe and in other parts of the world, is a very consequence of this system of tax evasion and tax avoidance that we've seen, and of neoliberal policies which have, again, used wage dumping and tax dumping as a means to develop economies, because instead it has had the opposite result. It has made people poor, it has made them more stressed out, and it has made them look for simple solutions. And those simple solutions are often nationalistic ones, which we know do not always work.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that.
Yeah.
Jeff Sommers, thank you. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
This program is made possible in part by the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, one of America's top research universities, preparing students for today's interdependent world with internationally focused academic and outreach programs.